It's 1880. 15 years had passed since the end of the Civil War, but former Confederate Major Samuel Lawrence James still had a hard time accepting the South's defeat. He cursed the Northerners with his last words for taking away his primary source of income. James was a noble planter and a slaveholder. The North had forbidden him and all America the use of slave labor, and for that, he truly hated them. James sometimes tried to exploit former slaves on his plantations out of an old memory, but this threatened legal liability. And then it hit James. He thought, what if instead of using slaves, he used prison labor? For in Louisiana, where James lived, the practice had been in use since 1844. When official slavery ended in 1965, prisoner leasing spread across the South as an alternative. The state rented out convicts serving their sentence to planters. They paid their wages directly to the warden. By 1880, Samuel James had about 8,000 acres of land at his disposal. They called his holdings Angola, after the country the plantation workers had come from. After they abolished slavery, many of them became outlaws and petty criminals by their own and sometimes by others' will. The Louisiana State Penitentiary rented out former slaves to Samuel James, where he essentially enslaved them again, for James had almost complete power over them on his lands, and the state laws only encouraged this state of affairs. Fines were imposed for minor infractions, which the ex-slaves could not pay, so they had to go to the plantations in Angola. Being an employee of the planter, one was subjected to cruel treatment. James took his revenge on them for their defeat in the war. He had complete control over the convicts' housing and food. Many workers ended up dying because of the harsh working conditions. James himself rubbed his hands cheerfully as his smugness was amused by the fact that in a country where they had abolished slavery, he continued to use virtual slave labor on an industrial scale. In 1894, the slave planter passed away and a massive chunk of land was left without a master. The Louisiana state government took a long time to figure out what to do with the property next. With many prisoners left in Angola, the government decided not to change much. So, in 1901, Angola officially became a prison. And 2 years before that, the leasing of convicts was abolished, although the practice continued in other states until 1928. Many Angolan prisoners breathed a sigh of relief. Now slavery would finally end, for being a prisoner was far better than being a slave. But it wasn't to be. Prison conditions remained as dreadful as they could be. Angola began to get criminals from all over the US. The fame of this prison spread fast. Even the most hardened murderers and villains had their knees quivering with fear when they found out they had to serve their time in a Louisiana prison. Most of the prisoners were of African descent. A staff of 90 perceived Angola as their domain. The Louisiana State Penitentiary had the least financial resources compared to other prisons. Knowing that black criminals primarily populated Angola, officials in the early 20th century were reluctant to allocate any money and preferred to divert surplus funds to other institutions. All of this contributed to anarchy and chaos inside the prison. Attacks and riots became commonplace. 1 in 10 inmates were stabbed during their sentence. However, another statistic is far more depressing. 90% of all Angolan prisoners do not leave the prison walls during their lifetime. Many stayed there even after death. Point Lookout Cemetery in northern Angola is probably one of the largest prison cemeteries. It is not just local prisoners who are buried there. All the prisoners who have been rendered unnecessary by their deaths are taken to Angola. Their graves are cared for by lifelong convicts who will later also lie in this land. But those convicts who demonstrated good behavior managed to get more pleasant jobs. They became low-level guards and watched over the rest of the prisoners. This system was introduced in 1917. It allowed the prison authorities to save some money off the guards and some prisoners to improve their conditions a little. But for the vast majority of prisoners, Angola continued to be a living hell. And it wasn't just the wicked guards who took its toll, but also nature itself. It was an ordinary, unremarkable day in 1922. A few prisoners were clearly in high spirits. They had sent them to work in a sugar factory in Angola. Life in prison wasn't sweet, so the boys were delighted to pocket some sugar. But just as they were about to go inside, they heard a loud and strange sound. A dam had burst near the colony. The factory building was not the best place to wait out the flood. The boys rushed to the exit, but it was too late. The water rose so fast that these prisoners were trapped. The ferry evacuated the remaining prisoners along with the prison staff. Just when the unfortunates thought it was all over, they discovered more trouble. Vegetables and cereals grew on Angola's territory, which the prisoners also ate. The crops had been hit by the flood, which meant a severe and prolonged famine awaited them all. Even prison director Farquhar fell into despair, but not for long. He immediately got a good idea. Farmers in the neighborhood could no longer tolerate the constant flooding destroying crops. They happily sold their plots to Farquhar when he offered to purchase the land, even if very cheaply. Thus, the Louisiana State Penitentiary grew by another 10,000 acres. And this, in turn, increased the number of prisoners. The prison expansion probably only had a positive effect on the thickness of Farquhar's pocket. The prisoners, on the other hand, continued to suffer in unbearably harsh conditions. When the Great Depression hit America, officials didn't even care about some prisoners on the outskirts of the U.S. So in the 1930s, money stopped flowing to Angola altogether. Imagine how the prisoners felt at that time. They were left abandoned and forgotten. They were forced to continue to work to the bone when the country was in chaos. Naturally, many could not stand it, especially guys like Charlie Frazier didn't like the situation. He was one of Louisiana's most dangerous criminals. His raids and murders were legendary. He was bloodthirsty and adventurous. Slave labor on the plantations was not his thing. So in 1933, the convict recidivist staged the biggest escape in Angola's history, shaking up Louisiana. It was an unprecedented event for those times. Crowds of prisoners fled in all directions, demolishing everything in their path. During the escape, they killed 2 prison officials and another prisoner who also worked as a guard. It's not known how many crimes they've already committed on the outside. Rumor has it that Frazier killed an 11-year-old girl during his escape. Then the convict made his way as far as Texas, where the police caught him. This case has terrified state officials and prison staff alike. They came to their jobs fearing it might be their last day. It became clear that dangerous criminals needed special treatment. So, in 1935, the Red Hat Corps came into existence. They housed dangerous criminals who were prone to escape. To make them stand out from other prisoners while working on the plantations, their hats were dyed red. The guards kept a close eye on the number of red spots in the field. If they suddenly became fewer, they raised the alarm. The number of escapes has since decreased markedly. Yet, there were still some who regularly left the prison building and returned each time. Or rather, something. We're talking about the electric chair. Until 1940, criminals were hanged. But at some point, the government decided it wasn't humane or progressive enough. It's much better to electrocute murderers. Only the state of Louisiana wasn't very accommodating to this change. The laws only required that a convicted person be executed in the county where they committed the crime. And there was only one electric chair for the whole state in Angola. So this means the execution machine had to travel all over the state to take the lives of murderers and other villains with it. The inmates even gave the chair the name Gruesome Gertie. Gertie struck fear into the state until 1956, when it finally settled in Angola, where executions took place permanently. She is now retired. Gruesome Gertie terrifies and fascinates visitors to the museum, located at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. But there were enough horrors in Angola without the electric chair. For several prisoners, conditions proved so unbearable that they cut their Achilles tendons in protest. Imagine the hell that went on if they were willing to make themselves invalids for life rather than go out on the plantation again. These prisoners were named the Heel String Gang because of this act. Angola itself had by then become known as the bloodiest and cruelest prison in the South. It was also called the Southern Alcatraz. Prisoner William Sadler, deafened after an attack by a fellow inmate, wrote an article titled "Hell on Angola" that galvanized the public and forced the start of reforms to the system. Some of these reforms appealed to prisoners and guards alike. In 1965, for example, there was one of the biggest prison rodeos ever. But to get to the rodeo, inmates have to do their best. For a long time, they have to be role models, refraining from stabbings, fights, and other forbidden activities between inmates. Incarcerated criminals take great pleasure in trying to saddle unrestrained horses and bulls. There are injuries, of course, but it's nothing compared to what used to happen inside the prison walls. A rodeo with criminals, what a spectacle! No wonder it started attracting the attention of ordinary law-abiding citizens. So, by 2000, the prison authorities opened a 10,000-seat stadium with pay-per-view. Tourists come with their families to watch yesterday's killer try to hold on to an aggressive, unridden bull. And the proceeds are spent on religious programs to re-educate prisoners. What would you change about institutions like the Louisiana State Penitentiary? How do you make prisons more efficient and humane at the same time? Write your thoughts in the comments section.